music that we like. We didn't really have any idea that what we were doing would ever become part of the commercial status quo or become commercially successful. But that's also a big reason why I think the music was so strong, because we were all doing it literally for the sake of entertaining ourselves and making good music.
Some remarks and comments from the man himself in his own words. Today we join you from our Billboard offices here in New York on what is probably an unfortunate Billboard Live in remembrance of Chris Cornell, who passed away overnight at the age of 52. My name is Kevan Kenney. I'm joined today by Chris Payne, a staff writer here at Billboard.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Andrew, a senior associate editor here at Billboard as well.
What's up, Kevin?
Thanks for stopping by on what was a sad day, a somber day. And I want to start there about what we're kind of feeling as reports start to come out from the Associated Press of Chris taking his own life overnight in a Detroit hotel room. What were your initial feelings when you heard the news?
For me personally, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but for me it was just like, not again. Like, we've lost so many of like the iconic frontmen of Seattle grunge specifically in the 90s and just kind of 90s alternative rock in general. I remember it was only a couple of years ago that Scott Weiland passed, and that felt unbelievably premature too, even though he'd obviously had tremendous issues with drugs and personal demons, and maybe Chris Cornell did too, to an extent that we didn't even realize at the time. But 90s alternative rock is kind of it's my bedrock sort of music. It's the stuff that changed my life when I was younger, and the fact that we're not even that late into most of these dudes' careers and lives, and we're already down to dwindling numbers here, and it's pretty incredible. It's not the way it should be.
No. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, he was not an old person. He was 52. He'd been gone through a lot of demons and through hardships in his life, but from all accounts and what people seemed to think was that he was in good spirits. Like Gary Graff, who freelance writer for Billboard, covered the show last night, his last show, and
Gary was there.
Yeah, he was there. He saw the show firsthand, and he was just writing in his review for Billboard.com about how Chris was just so positive and like fist bumping fans in the crowd and singing so well, and really just gave a great performance. Like, it's such a shock to hear this news.
I've heard reports myself today of just going over articles of the band talking to the audience about dates that were coming up and these plans to hit these towns, and obviously unexpected. Actually, you bring up that show that Gary Graff was at last night. We actually have video of that show, what would turn into Chris Cornell's final performance ever. We're going to show you a little bit of that right now. Again, that's footage from the Soundgarden show last night featuring Chris Cornell, taken by a fan in the audience out in Detroit. Jason Lipschitz wrote an amazing article today, and he's touched on the first song that he listened to. And it was Jason does this all the time in his articles, but he has this way of sort of articulating so well these things we all go through this time in a tragedy here. But that is sort of something that I know I do. You guys probably do too. Is that, you get this news, and the way we mourn as music fans is, we put on a record or we put on a song by that artist. Did you guys have a song that you went to this morning?
Yeah, actually. So I wrote about this too. One of the songs that we actually heard earlier over one of the clips was "Say Hello to Heaven," which was a song that he did as part of Temple of the Dogs, a supergroup that Chris Cornell had with various members of Soundgarden and Pearl Jam before either of them really got famous. But it was a tribute to Andrew Wood of Mother Love Bone, who was kind of, they were going to be the big grunge band, and he OD'd unfortunately before they really got their moment in the sun. But yeah, he wrote this absolutely gorgeous song to him, Chris Cornell did, called "Say Hello to Heaven," and they were roommates, and it has this very kind of personal feeling to it, and it's very. It's a pretty heavy power ballad, but it doesn't feel like overly dramatic. It feels kind of very steady, and then it's got a sort of life goes on feeling to it. But obviously he's got this unbelievable voice, and if I wrote about this, but if you wanted somebody to kind of welcome you to the other side, like he's got the voice to do it, and not many others like it.
You speak about his relationship with the members of Mother Love Bone and Pearl Jam, and a lot of those members do overlap. You think about Chris as such an influential singer and performer, but if you watch, a documentary like Pearl Jam 20, which came out a number of years ago, he's influential in the way I think he introduced some of the members of Pearl Jam and hooked them up with apartments back in the day, and he was really influential in that Seattle scene.
Yeah, I think all those bands were kind of intertwined in weird ways, and yeah, certainly when they hooked up for Temple of the Dog, I think Eddie Vedder wasn't even really like a permanent part of Pearl Jam yet, or maybe he had just become one.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think that song was kind of a big moment for both artists. Sorry, that song, Hunger Strike, which was the other kind of big single on that album. And I remember talking to the video director of that a couple of years ago, and he said that Chris Cornell, he was already kind of a star at that point, but Eddie Vedder was the one that the camera really was drawn to, and that he had this magnetism, and that even though he wasn't a star yet, he could tell that he was going to be one. But Chris Cornell was actually the bigger star at the time, because Pearl Jam hadn't really done anything yet.
Yeah, Chris, first song you listened to when you heard the news?
Well, the first thing I read this morning after reading the obituary and the initial news was the piece we were just talking about by this guy about Say Hello to Heaven. And just, I had been familiar, of course, with Cornell's music before, but I don't think I had ever really focused on just how crazy talented of a vocalist he was. I think with rock music, sometimes it's easy to sort of gloss over just pure vocals when there's just like great drumming and guitar performances to focus on. But I think this guy Andrew over here did a great job of articulating that. And aside from that, just the first thing on the way over that I flipped on when I was just coming to work on the subway this morning was, Super Unknown. That's my jam from the Crowd Pleaser, The Favorite. That's the album that got me into Soundgarden in the first place. So
back in I think like '94 that album came out.
I mean, I wasn't rocking out. I was like 4 years old back then, 4 or 5 years old. So like I was not that cool. Actually, I have memory of the Black Hole Sun music video. It's so wacky, but I don't think I really internalized it back then because I was younger. Like I didn't really get into rock music till the early 2000s. So I think my initial real memory of really remembering Soundgarden was actually playing Black Hole Sun in Rock Band.
Classic.
So many songs on that video game, man. I feel like
hell yeah,
people got introduced to. You bring up Super Unknown. It's kind of, I guess you could say, they've had so much work before then, but that album would go on to hit #1 on the Billboard 200 back in the day. So many hit singles off that, Black Hole Sun being one of them, Fell on Black Days being one of them. But let's go actually back to your first memories, both of you, of hearing Chris's voice. It's such an iconic voice. You could argue it's the voice of that generation of rock. Let's start with you, Andrew. What is your first memories of hearing Chris Cornell's voice? Well,
it's hard for me to really remember. I mean, Soundgarden for me were kind of one of the those bedrock bands that the music kind of started with them for me. Not obviously not really, but I only started really getting into alt rock in 96, 97, and by that point Soundgarden was already on their way out. Really, I think they broke up either late 96 or early 97. But they were already such a presence on the radio, and they were so established as one of the bands of that generation that it felt like they'd already been around forever, that they'd already basically become classic rock at that point. And as I said, the first memory of Chris Cornell's voice, I don't really have a strong impression of. I definitely have a strong impression the first time I saw that Black Hole Sun video.
Oh yeah. Which
I remember watching at a sleepover at my friend's house, and not being able to get to sleep after that. Is a freaky video.
Yeah,
for sure.
But iconic, man. I mean, growing up watching MTV. I mean, that was in heavy.
That's one of the videos for certain. Yeah.
Yeah. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, Black Hole Sun. His vocals in the chorus of that, or I think just the instinctive go-to moment of Chris Cornell singing performance that was just embedded in my mind. Like I was saying, when I first played it on Rock Band, I think it just jogged a memory of something that was deep in me, that I think since I got into Super Unknown later, none of the other tracks, as much as I liked them, really triggered that in me. But now also thinking, I definitely also have some deep memories of Audio Slave songs on rock radio, early 2000s, because that's when I was just personally getting into rock music.
I was the same way, where I think Audio Slave, if I'm being honest, introduced me to Soundgarden, and then eventually Temple of the Dog. It was sort of reverse engineered in that way. We just touched on Temple of the Dog. Soundgarden, his solo stuff, Audio Slave. How do you think each of those projects will be remembered as part of Chris's legacy?
I was surprised last year when the Temple of the Dog project hit its 25th anniversary and they did this stadium tour together. They'd never toured before as a band. Because I was surprised both by sort of realizing just how much of a one-off kind of not thought that deeply thing it was back at the time. The fact they'd never toured behind it like back in the day, and also just how receptive people were to it now, and that there really was this kind of strong affection for the project and for the people involved. I think that actually, like as I said, Say Hello to Heaven was the first thing I thought of this morning, mostly because it fits so well into kind of being its own elegy for Chris Cornell. But like also, I just think that that's one of the best songs he ever sang, as is Hunger Strike, as is a couple other songs on that album.
Absolutely.
So I think that album is actually has endured and is going to endure pretty well, all things considered. Audio Slave it's going to be interesting because they had a much bigger disparity in between their commercial and critical reception than either of Chris Cornell's other bands, and that like when Audio Slave came out, I think they were kind of they sold well, but they were kind of dismissed by the tastemakers. And
why was that, do you think?
Because I think people were expecting more from it. It kind of had it had this like sort of like mathematical kind of built-in like expectation to it, because wow, like the rhythm section for Rage Against the Machine and Chris Cornell singing like how could this not be the best thing ever?
Yeah.
And it wasn't really like as strong or as innovative as I think either of those acts were on their own. By that point in their career, they'd kind of gotten onto like a second phase where they weren't like trying as much new stuff, and they weren't really like looking to push the envelope that significantly. But what they did was they wrote these really big rock songs, and Jason wrote about this in his piece, and he wrote about it really well. And that like, they basically at that point, they kind of embraced being a classic rock band, and that these two factions came from bands that were more definitive of their own generation, but these were just kind of songs that could have existed almost at any time. They could have been 70s rock songs, 80s rock songs, and they would have probably been just as massive in those other eras. And so I think you might find in 10, 15 years when kind of all rock music from the last 50 years is just classic rock, that you'll hear Soundgarden songs, Temple of the Dog songs, and Audio Slave songs next to each other on the radio, and they won't seem that conspicuously different as they did when they were released in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also he had some really successful solo work too. Like he had a song on the Casino Royale soundtrack for James Bond.
That's right.
He had and within different eras, like he did a solo album after Soundgarden broke up, then he did one after Audio Slave. So he was putting out solo music under his own name, which often showed off his own vocal work more than albums with a band would, so
right.
he was able to put his own solo work out there and really supplement all that he was doing with his different bands throughout his career. So I think that'll endure. And obviously Soundgarden, I think, is like the easy answer. Like that was the most critically acclaimed band, the biggest seller. But like we've been touching on, because younger people were usually introduced to Cornell through Audio Slave, and I think now because more people our age are coming in, like we're talking about Jason's piece, more people like our age are coming into music writing and media and taking on this stuff and being the critics to appraise this next wave of stuff. I think you could see more people coming around to Audio Slave and reaching back for Temple of the Dog, because like they were never super appreciated when they first made music, because that was before Pearl Jam broke up. But after it, the rest is history.
We talk about him working with members of Pearl Jam. We talk about that Seattle scene, bringing up Mother Love Bone before. Something I feel like that we just need to sort of address is this, like you said at the top, Andrew, not another one. We've lost Scott Weiland in 2015. We've lost Lane Staley going back. We've lost, Andrew Wood going way back, Kurt Cobain. What does that say about that time in music? And if there is anything to say, what does that say about the grunge rock era, that we've lost a decent amount of these frontmen?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of draw your own conclusions based on the consistent drug usage among some of the bands. I mean, we don't really know how involved that was with Chris Cornell yet, but obviously, heroin was very prevalent in that time, in that scene, and these dudes were not writing happy rock songs to begin with. They were obviously like they were very considered and very, either if not outright torture, then at least very like introspective and haunted people. And it's still stark. I think no matter how you kind of try to draw conclusions based on common factors among these 4 or 5 like major frontmen, the odds I think are still unbelievably against it of them all having died within 25 years of breaking out.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of a tragedy that you try to find sense in. You try to say, well, maybe there's this reason or that reason, but it's just so some movements are just kind of star-crossed like that, and it seems like this is one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this makes me think last year, Scott Stapp, the singer from Creed, came through the Billboard office, and I interviewed him here for my podcast, and he had been tortured with a lot of addictions. He had gotten sober and recovered, and had really turned his life around, and it was just a really positive, eye-opening experience talking to Scott about that. And it wasn't exactly the same scene, but he came out of a same era where I think maybe around turn of the millennium, I think attitudes might have been just less out in the open about mental health and drug addictions, and hopefully people these days, younger people in music, because music does tend to attract a lot of people who might have social anxiety or prone to depression. I think a lot of creatives are like this, and I think hopefully now people are more open about discussing these things, and that leads to more productive ways of dealing with these issues without turning to drugs. And if people do have issues with drugs, hopefully there's more ways to talk about it,
Right.
face it.
One of the things that was interesting to me going back, and one of our editors, bosses, sort of pointed this out, is that you don't necessarily think of Soundgarden as being kind of a sort of brooding rock band the way these other bands were. Some of them, you don't think of Chris Cornell as being a particularly tortured guy, partly because they're such there's such a big stadium rock outfit, and Chris Cornell as a lyricist wasn't necessarily that wasn't necessarily his forte. He didn't write that kind of dark poetry that Kurt Cobain or Lane Staley did necessarily. But you look back and a lot of his songs are about death, a lot of his songs are about suicide, a lot of his songs are about pain in ways that maybe you don't appreciate just because everybody else at the time songs were even darker and even more about death and pain. And so
That's a really good point.
It's remarkable to think of just how normalized that was in 90s rock at the time, especially if you compare it to something like overseas, this the Britpop movement was going on. I can't think of a single fatality from that scene, even though it happened basically around the same time. All of Oasis and Blur and Pulp and all those bands, they're doing all right.
Yeah,
they were doing drugs too, but different drugs and just a different temperament to that scene, I guess.
Yeah, no, well said. We're up here remembering and offering our thoughts on Chris Cornell today, but the music community and the world of music has been doing their share of doing that as well, reflecting on Chris Cornell's life. And we're going to go to some tweets right now from some pretty big names in the music world that we'll read for you here. We're going to kick things off with Elton John, who took to Twitter to write, "Shocked and saddened by the sudden death of Chris Cornell, a great singer, songwriter, and the loveliest man." That's Elton John on Twitter. Steven Tyler took to Twitter and Instagram, and a really beautiful passage from Steven Tyler where he says, "There's a new star in the heavens tonight that will shine forever from the memory of your dream. You were the icing on every band you played with. You were a great friend, Chris. The world will miss you deeply, sadly, lovingly." That's again from Steven Tyler. Jimmy Page, you want to talk about rock legends, paying his respects as well, saying, "Rest in peace, Chris Cornell. Incredibly talented, incredibly young, incredibly missed." Again, Jimmy Page on Twitter. That's how those individuals are remembering Chris Cornell today. How do you think Chris Cornell will be remembered? Sort of in closing here, if we can sort of wrap things up with the years going forward, how do you think Chris Cornell and his legacy will be remembered?
Well, the interesting thing to me about all those tweets that you just read is that they're all from rock stars of a generation earlier. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can kind of see there that that's sort of who Chris Cornell was too. He was very much a rock star. He wasn't, and maybe that's part of why this is so shocking, is because he didn't seem necessarily as reluctant as some of the other stars of his era. Even Eddie Vedder was very slow to embrace fame, and he still obviously has his difficulties with it. But Chris Cornell, he was out there. He was shirtless. His hair was wild. He seemed very much the prototypical rock star, and his songs were rock star songs. They were huge anthems and power ballads and just stadium filling rave ups, and it didn't seem like that was something that was ever going to fade for him. It seemed like no matter where he went, no matter who he worked with after that, he was always going to be that kind of star. And I think that's how he will be remembered, as kind of the definitive rock star of the 90s.
Yeah, I think alongside all the stuff we've been talking about the sadder side, yeah, like what Andrew was saying, the dude was just such an incredible talent, and I think to make people feel better and just kind of embrace just the incredible performer he was, like I mean, he was probably one of the best rock vocalists, like pure vocalists there really ever was. Like when you were writing about the Temple of the Dog song, I think you compared him to Whitney Houston as just like one of the best, just straight up like one of the best vocalists who came out of that era.
Yeah, just in terms of like the sheer raw power.
Yeah.
Like you have to go outside of rock to find like people who are his peers, really.
He was like a near 4-octave singer. Like he had an incredible range, and I think it's very rare that people that talented don't come into the music world through like, you know, pop or through Broadway or being discovered some way.
Grunge band, you know?
It's crazy. It's really interesting how talent just comes to the surface and manifests itself, and it was really incredible how it came out of that Seattle scene with him.
Yeah.
And they were the first band really from that scene that went to a major label. Like people think of Nevermind as the thing that started all, but Soundgarden signed with A&M a few years before that. Like they were kind of the forerunners of that.
And it's cool when you hear these guys, these classic Seattle acts in interviews, like they all looked up to Soundgarden, you know, back in the day when they were breaking in. But an iconic voice, an iconic career, and I think we can all agree gone far too soon, that being Chris Cornell. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time. You're very busy around these parts, so I appreciate you paying your respects. It is quite a day, well said. Keep it locked to Billboard.com, we should probably say, for the very latest. This is probably a story that will develop and change as the days and weeks go on. And thank you very much for tuning in.